Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Martha Ross, Senior Fellow with the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, and welcome to today's event, Economic Recovery in American Cities, How Federal Jobs Programs Can Combat Unemployment. This is part of our COVID-19 Metro Recovery Watch, series of virtual events and briefs highlighting strategies to build economies that are robust, inclusive, and equitable. I want to thank the Kresge Foundation, the Ralph C. Wilson Foundation, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for making the Metro Recovery Watch series and events possible. The previous event featured Mayor Lori Lightfoot of Chicago and Helene Gale, president of the Chicago Community Trust, and I urge you to check it out. On to today. We are seeing COVID-19 wreak havoc upon American life with staggering economic, social, and health impacts. In this event, we are specifically discussing employment and how a federal jobs program could address the massive job loss we have experienced in the past 9 months. Layoffs and furloughs have pushed millions of workers and families to the financial brink, and both the public health and the economic impacts have been disproportionately borne by people of color. And even as unemployment drops, the scope and pace of hiring now is nowhere near enough to compensate for the scope of the job loss. Massive unemployment requires a proportionate response, and only the federal government has the capacity to meet this challenge. To help us think through this, we pulled together an impressive lineup of speakers who are working at this local, state, and federal levels. We will hear pre-recorded comments from U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar, and then move into a discussion with three panelists: Susanna Fritz, Executive Director of Birmingham Strong; Bruce Saito, Director of the California Conservation Corps; and Derrick Hamilton, Professor of Economics and Urban Policy at the New School. Following that, we'll open the discussion to include questions from the audience. Viewers can submit questions via email to events@brookings.edu or via Twitter to @BrookingsMetro using #MetroRecovery. Next up, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Senator Klobuchar, Democrat from Minnesota. We're very pleased to have her, and she's been a longstanding proponent of expanded federal service, something you'll hear much more about in the following remarks. She'll speak for about 10 minutes, so I'll see you on the other side. Thanks for coming.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to join all of you today, virtually, of course. You know that I'm doing well. My head's almost as big as the Capitol. That's what I love about virtual screenshots behind you. Thank you to Martha and the Brookings Institution for inviting me to discuss how the federal government can help unemployed Americans get back to work. You all know we've been living through an incredibly challenging time in this country, battling a global pandemic, which has upended the financial security of American workers and their families. But we now have an opportunity to move forward. Why? Well, the American people have chosen Joe Biden as the 46th president of the United States and my friend Kamala Harris as vice president. We know we're still waiting on the Senate based on what's happening in Georgia, but the election is now behind us for president. No matter who you voted for, it's time now, in Joe Biden's words, to give each other a chance and to unite, because that's the only way we're going to be able to tackle both the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression and its root cause, the coronavirus pandemic. I thought Joe's words when he said the grim era of demonization should be behind us, and he said we should think of this moment as an American moment instead of a partisan moment. And I'm not being a Pollyanna here. I know this is going to be tough, but I do think we have the potential right now in the next few months to move forward, and certainly when he becomes president. Unfortunately, as I noted, we're in the middle of this pandemic, but we're also in the middle of a new surge of this devastating virus. Last week, we set records with over 160,000 cases and 60,000 hospitalizations in a single day. And in addition to the public health crisis, we know that the pandemic has upended the financial security of so many. At the peak of this crisis, the unemployment rate was over 14%. Over 30 million people were collecting unemployment, and we had the worst quarterly GDP in recorded U.S. history. One Yelp study showed that 800 businesses closed every day in the 6 months after the beginning of the pandemic, and according to an estimate from our host today, the Brookings Institution, over 400 small businesses have closed for good. That's a lot. The president can tweet about how things have turned around because the third quarter GDP numbers looked good and the stock market was up, but that's missing the fundamentals on the ground. We're still down 10 million jobs, and our economy is 3.5% smaller than it was at the beginning of the year. We've lost 1.3 million state and local government jobs as first responders and teachers have been laid off at the worst possible time. And in October, the number of long-term unemployed workers grew by 50%, the biggest spike on record. So now is the time for action. We're not facing small challenges, and it's not the time for small solutions. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell made it clear that it would be tragic, those are his words, not mine, if Congress failed to pass another economic relief package, since providing too little support would create, in his words, unnecessary hardship for households and businesses. So the House passed the HEROES Act back in May, as well as a much reduced version of the legislation in October. That was an attempt, of course, by Speaker Pelosi to work with the White House. And for months, I've been calling on my Senate colleagues to take up and pass much needed relief legislation. Literally, Speaker Pelosi was willing to meet in the middle and meet them halfway. But sadly, our negotiating partners have been unwilling to compromise. Now is the time. We should be thinking big because families, businesses, and cities all across America are counting on it. More than 80 years ago, the Great Depression threatened our way of life in a way that's somewhat similar to what we're seeing today. What did our country do back then? We didn't back down. And one of the measures this country put into place, which has stood the test of time, is public service. In fact, Congress created citizen service programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration. You know, it's worth watching a documentary that came out in the last few years on Frances Perkins. The Minnesotans put it together, so I happened to watch it, FDR's labor secretary. And it's all about what she did, what President Roosevelt did, what they did in the first 100 days when they got into office. And of course, one of the things that became a major focus was the creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps and what they did where they had this disconnect between so many people out of work, but yet projects that needed to be done and people that needed help. These efforts resulted in millions of people who benefited from paid employment and opportunities to develop skills, all the while constructing national park, public lands infrastructure, and producing cultural works that are enjoyed to this day. In my office, I actually have one of the paintings, a huge mural done by the Corps at that time by an artist, the WPA. And it's this amazing thing, and it's called The Gathering of the Raspberries, and it's from beautiful, beautiful painting. And after President Obama came in the Smithsonian, they had all of these murals collected, those WPA murals. And I realized the one I had in my office that's on loan from the Wiseman Art Gallery in Minnesota was actually as big of any in the Smithsonian. And I almost called the head of the Smithsonian to say, look what I have in my office. And I thought, I love it in my office. But when we're out of this pandemic, people should come by to see it. It's an amazing thing. And hung in a post office for a long, long time and then was given to the art gallery. So I see it every single day. I see the effect of the Civilian Conservation Corps when I go hiking in Minnesota and around the country, and I certainly see the WPA right there. So what do we do now? Well, we should learn a lot from the Great Depression and how they got out of it. And I think we need a public service expansion. During times of crisis, whether it's a natural disaster or recession, America's nonprofits have always stepped in to fill the gaps and help those in need. Unfortunately, many of those organizations are struggling financially at the very moment when our needs are soaring. The Work Now Act, which I introduced in May and which has been co-sponsored by 13 of my Senate colleagues, would create a $50 billion grant program to help nonprofit organizations retain their employees and scale their service delivery. At the same time, it would provide millions of unemployed Americans with new jobs, helping their fellow Americans. You know what people are suffering from right now: mental health problems, loneliness, seniors at home, having trouble getting groceries. Just needing someone to talk to over the phone. This legislation would provide a major mobilization of resources so Americans who recently lost their jobs can get back to work helping our nonprofits. Another way to meet the needs of the moment is to follow the Great Depression model directly. I figure my bill is sort of indirectly following it because we have so many more nonprofits than we did back then. But the other way, which I also support, is to expand national public service programs, which represent, of course, the best of our country. I joined my friend Senator Coons in introducing an ambitious bill that would expand our national service programs and create major new opportunities for Americans to serve their country. The Pandemic Response and Opportunity through National Service Act would fund 750,000 national service positions over 3 years, in part to meet the projected need for as many as 300,000 public health workers, who are truly the heroes of our time. Our bill would also expand partnerships between AmeriCorps and federal health agencies and increase the AmeriCorps Living Allowance to open the door for all Americans to step up to serve, regardless of their financial circumstances. And since seniors are among our most active volunteers but face unique health risks during the pandemic, the bill includes a provision based on my bipartisan bill with Senator Cassidy of Louisiana, the Senior Corps Distance Volunteering Act, to provide new digital tools to help Senior Corps members continue their service from their homes. One of my predecessors, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, once said this. He said, "Life's unfairness is not irrevocable. We can help balance the scales for others, if not always for ourselves." A sentiment repeated closer today by one Tyler Perry, who said this: "Your beginning should not dictate your destiny." That's exactly what both public service and our nation's charitable organizations can help to do. Balance the scales. Make sure that your beginning doesn't always dictate your destiny. So in times of uncertainty and hardship, we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to expand and support our nonprofits. We also need to find creative ways to support the creation of new businesses that will put people back to work. One of the most celebrated findings in recent economic research is the finding that new startup businesses account for almost all new jobs in this country. If we lose a generation of startups, we're going to lose a generation's worth of new jobs and new ideas. If that's the legacy of this pandemic, we're going to be struggling with unemployment for years to come, a worst-case scenario. Even before the pandemic, business formation rates had fallen to near 4 decades lows, what they call a startup slump. Ever since the 2008 financial crisis, new business starts have actually been outpaced by business closures, and now the coronavirus pandemic has only made the problem worse. Of course, the startup slump is not the only challenge facing entrepreneurs. You've got the challenge of monopolies and the fact that it's harder and harder to get a new business started, something that I am looking forward to taking on in the next year. Another persistent challenge is the lack of diversity among new business founders. This lack of diversity in venture capital disproportionately impacts women and minority entrepreneurs who face challenges in accessing equity-based financing, and those obstacles have only been made tougher during the pandemic. We can't afford to miss the next great inventor just because she's a female or a minority. And we can't miss out on the next great innovative business just because that idea didn't make its way from the Valley. The new Business Preservation Act that I introduced earlier this year with Senators Coons, Kaine, and King specifically directs investment funding to people and places that have historically been overlooked by venture capital firms. It's a win-win that supports our economy and our underserved communities. Congress must continue to work with small business owners, especially women and those who face barriers, to stimulate innovation and create jobs to move our country forward. We need to harness the efforts of workers, small business founders, government, and nonprofits, all working together to address the persistent challenge of unemployment, especially as we confront the pandemic. You know, in my office, I have a picture hanging on the wall. It's a drawing of a woman who is holding the planet Earth in her hand. It's being handed to her by an angel. The words read, "In my dream, the angel shrugged and said, if we fail this time, it will be a failure of imagination." And then she placed the world gently in the palm of my hand. Well, we have the world in the palms of our hands right now. And make no mistake, these are serious times. We know the solutions are out there, the vaccine, the way we get to the other side, to what I call the day after tomorrow when this has ended, the workforce training, the ideas to get capital out to underserved areas, the ideas to finally make sure that our nonprofits are able to serve the people they need to serve, and that we expand our basically today's version of the Conservation Corps with AmeriCorps and similar groups. We can do this, but we need a little imagination in this town of Washington, D.C. So I ask you to keep advocating for the good. We will rise to the occasion. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I'd like to ask the panelists to join me on the screen. And let me remind you, as you do, to turn on your cameras and microphone. We just heard some good remarks from the senator urging us to think big, to use imagination, drawing upon the legacy of the Great Depression and the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps. And needing to, quote, meet the needs of the moment. So what we're going to do now in this discussion is to hear about different models for providing publicly funded jobs and the kinds of important and socially useful services that they can provide. And consider as well the merits of a federal jobs guarantee. We'll talk about how existing state and local efforts could be replicated at a national level, as well as the nuts and bolts questions of program design, administration, and funding. And as a reminder, you can submit questions via email to events@brookings.edu or via Twitter, going to @BrookingsMetro and using the hashtag #MetroRecovery. So the first round of questions, I'd like to cover the basics. And let's start with Susanna Fritzberg. You are the executive director of Birmingham Strong in Birmingham, Alabama. And in that role, you have led the creation of the Birmingham Service Corps, an innovative public-private effort to hire unemployed residents to meet pressing community needs related to the COVID-19 crisis. Can you tell us a bit more about that, about how the program is designed and how many people you've hired, what kind of work they do, and how you measure success?
Thank you, Martha. I'm really excited to be here today and share our story, and proud and privileged to be sharing time on the panel with Derrick and Bruce. So thank you for all the work to put this together. I'm really thrilled to hear the Senator's enthusiasm for work that is so close to my heart and very closely aligned to what we've been doing in Birmingham. Birmingham Strong, or BHAM Strong for short, is a public-private partnership that was launched in March of this year, so we're in startup mode, by the city of Birmingham and some local generous corporate partners. And our mission is to strengthen Birmingham's COVID-19 response and build economic resilience for the future of the city and its residents. So we were really formed in response to three needs: that Birmingham residents needed support to meet their own vital needs, that Birmingham's workers needed to be empowered to participate in a resilient, inclusive economy that overcomes COVID and is set up to thrive in the future, and that Birmingham institutions needed an agile partner that was wholly focused on COVID relief and recovery. So we work really hand in glove with the City of Birmingham, who's our major funder, as well as in partnership with local nonprofit organizations. And the vast majority of our activities are designed to be reimbursable through the Federal CARES Act. Our flagship program, and the one that I'll talk the most about in our conversation today, is the Birmingham Service Corps, which we launched in May of 2020, so very shortly after we started, as a way to leverage one of the challenges that Birmingham was facing, this crisis level and rising unemployment, against another one of the challenges, which was a series of new, evolving, and unmet community needs, from greater demand on our food systems to medical staffing shortfalls to an inability to access PPE. And really building on the model, as you mentioned, of the Great Depression era, WPA and other work relief programs. So the Service Corps functions to connect residents who are unemployed or underemployed to paid opportunities that are meeting community needs, primarily in the areas of public health, basic needs, and economic stabilization. We've staffed Corps members to projects from setting up community testing sites to assisting small businesses with PPP loan applications, assisting students with remote learning, and also actually one of our major programs is placing Corps members embedded with local nonprofits who are themselves direct service providers to residents. So in some cases, as an organization, we manage projects directly. In other cases, we kind of play that matching and almost operate like a nonprofit staffing agency, placing Corps members in a project that's managed by one of our partners. But our real sightline is always around COVID impact and serving Birmingham residents. We employ members of the Birmingham community, so people who reside here in the city of Birmingham, age 18 or older. On average, we're serving residents, or we're employing residents who are about 32, so a little bit on the older side. And for membership in the Corps, we select folks based on their skill set for the projects that we're looking to staff, and then really prioritize our values of equity and diversity. So we pay a living wage between $18 and $24 an hour, depending on the nature of the work. And I'll note that many of the workers that are coming through our programs previously had been employed in minimum wage jobs, which in Alabama is the federal minimum wage of $7.25. And just in closing, you asked how we measure success. And I think there are three core dimensions that we've been looking at. One is the direct and kind of immediate impact that we're having on Corps members themselves. So the number of paid placements to date, we've made about 350 placements. We know about 90% of the individuals that are Service Corps members are using their income to meet basic needs, from rent to utility payments or keeping current on debt. And we're also really focused on the communities that our membership represents. So we're proud that our membership is about 70% individuals of color, just over 65% Black, and also majority women. The second category would be the trajectory for our Corps members. So we're trying to track the number that are retained by host organizations after the placement that we make there, or have the opportunity to transition into a longer term or a private sector based role. And then finally, of course, we're focused on impact in the community. So to date, Corps members have performed about 8,000 hours of work across Birmingham. We've touched every neighborhood across the city. There are 99 total. We've embedded Corps members in over 50 nonprofits supporting direct service to Birmingham residents, and really supporting organizations that have an existing client base and existing service delivery mechanisms. And then we've also driven impact for small businesses. So I'll close just with an example of one of the things I'm most proud of, which is that in partnership with Hope Credit Union and the City of Birmingham, our Corps members supported applications from 175 diverse and women-led small businesses to the PPP program, which ended up supporting about 800 jobs locally. So we're really trying to magnify our impact in terms of who we're employing, the work that they're providing, and making sure that our values of diversity and equity are central in that.
Thank you so much, Susanna. Bruce Saito, next let's turn to you. You are the Executive Director of the California Conservation Corps, a state program housed within the California Natural Resources Agency. The Corps is modeled on the Civilian Conservation Corps from the 1930s, and you combine environmental conservation activities with education, mentoring, and employment for young people. And you have an awesome tagline: hard work, low pay, miserable conditions, and more. Can you tell us a bit more about the Conservation Corps, how it's administered, and the kinds of work that you do?
Thank you, Martha, and thank you for having me with this panel and an esteemed group of individuals. So the California Conservation Corps was created, developed by first-time Governor Jerry Brown in 1976. Yes, it was modeled after the Civilian Conservation Corps, with in true fashion of Governor Brown, a slightly different twist, that he wanted to make sure that California Conservation Corps not only, again, was modeled after the Civilian Conservation Corps, but also had some influences of Israeli kibbutz, Jesuit seminary, and a Marine Corps boot camp. And I say that because I think those kinds of ideas or values still apply today, and that's I think also interpreted or reflected in our tagline. It's not hard work. It's really just a challenge to do a good day of work for a good day of wage. It's not low pay. Minimum wage now in California will be $12 an hour in January. And going up, and some of our counties, Los Angeles and San Francisco, it's already up to $15 or more. And the miserable conditions, working out in Lake Tahoe in the forest on a beautiful summer day is not miserable conditions, although sometimes some folks might think of that. The CCC now today is about 1,500 Corps members that work statewide at 25 different centers, 25 centers all the way down in National City, San Diego, all the way up to Wairika and Redding. Of those 25 centers, 9 of them are residential centers. So young people stay, live, work together at a residential center, typically about 80 to 90 young folks in rural and both urban areas. In addition, though, since in these last 44 years, there's also been the development of what we call local conservation corps. So they're nonprofits or programs under their local county community and economic development departments. Those 14 local conservation corps, again, mostly nonprofits, do similar work. And that work and the mission of the CCC is to provide job training, work experience, and service opportunities for young adults 18 to 25 years old, as they in turn provide community and environmental services, again, throughout the state. In addition, nationally, there's something called the Corps Network that has a membership of over 135 conservation and service corps. So although I'm representing the state of California, there are local conservation corps as well as our conservation corps spread out throughout the United States. Again, it's a similar mission. Some are slightly different and work slightly different, but I think where this fits into this discussion and hearing the words of Senator Klobuchar, that's the work of the Corps. And that's I think, part of this the discussion we're having today, is that it's not only providing this job training and work opportunities and service opportunities for young folks, but also at the same time providing a service, enhancing trails, planting trees, developing parks. Already in California, it's really sad, but something I'm really proud of as well. In California, since July 1st, the CCC has logged over 1 million hours of emergency response to supporting fires, direct fire attack, supporting food banks because of COVID, distributing emergency supplies and the like, over 1 million hours of service. And like the Civilian Conservation Corps back, 50 years ago or back in the 1930s, that wasn't just an opportunity for a young man to make 30 bucks a month and send it back, 25 bucks, send it back home. But it also, like today, for corps all throughout the United States, it really was an opportunity to serve, to instill that sense of pride and sense of purpose and sense of doing something good, not only for your country, for your state, and not only for your community, but also for your family and you as an individual. So I think that's what the Corps is about today, and that's what why we're so interested, not just the CCC, but all corps throughout the United States, and how we can move forward on some of this legislation, the bills that Senator Klobuchar talked about, and other things that are percolating out there as we move into a new administration.
Thank you. Derrick Hamilton, now let's hear from you. You are Professor of Economics and Urban Policy at the New School and Founding Director of the Institute for the Study of Race, Stratification, and Political Economy. In the past several years, you have argued for a federal jobs guarantee in order to eliminate persistent involuntary unemployment. In this scenario, every American over the age of 18 who wants a job could get one, funded by the federal government and coordinated closely with state and local governments. And the jobs would address a wide variety of community needs. This is a big, bold policy proposal with big implications for the economy. Tell us more about the rationale for this program and some details about how it would work.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you. And let me say, it is big and bold. The problems we faced are big and bold and persistent, and I think need that type of policy to really redress them, and frankly, have the lofty goal of eliminating involuntary unemployment and the oxymoronic notion of working poverty altogether. But I wanted to quickly acknowledge Helen Lance Ginsburg, who recently passed away. She was a founding member of the National Committee for Full Employment, which was led by Coretta Scott King. I had the pleasure of serving on the board of the National Jobs for All Coalition with Helen. She was a tremendous force in this movement for decades. She represents what moral scholarship means. She was a professor at Brooklyn College, a graduate of the New School, and happy to take the time and just acknowledge her contributions. Indeed, this policy that we're talking about, however big and bold it might be, the concepts of economic rights aren't new, nor are they radical. FDR proposed in his State of the Union in 1944 an Economic Bill of Rights, and the second article was the right to employment. What it would be is it would literally, as you pointed out, everyone having not just a job, but a good job, a job with dignified wages, benefits, and health care, safe working conditions. When I say federal job guarantee, each of those words are important. It's important that the federal government ultimately is able to implement it because they have the financing capacities to literally have a guarantee. And it's also important that the jobs are public, that they're public jobs. This does not eliminate procurement, nor does it eliminate partnerships with nonprofits, but the federal job guarantee would shield us against partisan concerns that might arise from trying to implement the guarantee through nonprofits in the ways in which different administrations might co-opt missions of nonprofits and or the ways in which we decide which nonprofits would actually receive funding or not. I love Zoom. Let me acknowledge your little one that walked in. The federal job guarantee, hello. It would be a direct source of employment, and it would trigger a multiplying stimulus effect across the economy. So when we think about stimulus, and a way of doing it with a federal job guarantee could do it in a way that ensures that there's shared prosperity across all workers. It would, what else? It would empower workers that are already working by offering them greater bargaining power by removing that threat of being destitute from unemployment, because they would have a viable public option. It would structurally change the US economy. So some people argue, one of the critiques of the programs is, would it do away with low-wage work? Well, that's a feature, not a flaw. It would, if employers would want to compete for the American workforce, they would have to offer at least a base level of wages, working conditions, and benefits. And that, to me, is not a bad thing. That is a good thing and an attribute of the program. It would be counter-cyclical. So in times when we have despair, like this pandemic and its aftermath, it would kick in to a greater extent to ensure that everyone has a job that they desire. It would address our 21st century human and physical infrastructure needs. It would provide public works in a way to shield us against natural disasters. It would provide public works similar to how Bruce was describing, ensuring that every unit of America would have conservation attributes and be better protected when we have our climate change from our unnatural implementations of various infrastructure more broadly. The types of works and the type of work would include education, health services, supportive housing, libraries. We could fund art, public art, childcare. We could literally have a care economy where we fund childcare, elder care, adult care. We could have a green economy. We could make our cities and rural areas emission-free with municipalities. In other words, we could think about our future and use our greatest resource, which is our people, and employing our people to deliver on that desired future that we want. Disability-centered advocacy could be facilitated with this, so it would be inclusive of all people, including those that might have a disability, both by providing them pathways to work, but also providing infrastructure that create better livable situations. What else? The most urgent needs could be addressed in a forthright way. So we could develop a job bank of tasks at local levels. People in local communities might know better what they need. Well, we could develop that job bank. And not only would it be counter-cyclical, it would be regional stabilizing as well. So those areas that might be hardest hit by economic transformation, well, they would have the most urgent needs, and that's where the program would kick in the most. I feel like I'm talking, wow, let me just say one last thing about it, then I'll stop. And I lied, two things. One, it would reduce the strain on local and state budgets by having a better tax base of workers, but it would also address the moral hazard problem we're faced with when we have a typical recession and we have the concept of too big to fail. Having to bail out Wall Street that might have engaged in some malfeasance that could have got us here, well, we won't be at that threat of a collapse because Main Street would be taken care of with a federal job guarantee.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All of you have given us a good sense of the nature of your programs and your policy ideas. Next, I want to ask about racial equity. In good times and bad, people of color generally have higher unemployment and lower wages than the national average. And this can't be explained away by educational attainment or occupational choice. So there is a legacy of racism in our economy that we have to address. How could the various programs or ideas that you have talked about help us do that? We'll start with Susanna, then turn to Bruce, then to Derrick.
Thanks, Martha. As everyone on this call and certainly on this panel is aware, COVID is a public health crisis that has led to an economic crisis due to a failure of response. And both of those crises run along existing lines of inequality and precarity. And we see this so apparently in cities like Birmingham. Birmingham's the 4th largest majority Black city in the country. And our residents are especially vulnerable to both the public health and the economic impacts of COVID-19. So before the crisis, half of Birmingham families with children already lived in poverty. Now we're seeing record number of workers that have been laid off, and thousands of jobs in our metro area that frankly we don't anticipate coming back. And we know that unemployment is heavily concentrated among lower wage workers. Birmingham has a particularly large non-tradable economy, so a lot of service restaurant sector workers, and most of the folks that are facing unemployment have less than $1,000 in savings. So again, everyone on this call I think is probably tracking the expiration date of CARES benefits and the eviction moratoria and other elements of the federal response quite closely. But we're hearing that from the people that we serve, certainly a concern around rising instability as we see some of those things expire, and then also the recognition that many of them are quite inadequate in the first place. As we think about our services and kind of where we're rooted in place, as I mentioned, we're targeted towards our most vulnerable workers. So we employ about 70% workers of color. And frankly, that also just reflects the precarity of those workers to the economic downturn. The greater numbers of workers of color who lack access to unemployment benefits, because we do see a greater proportion of folks that are served through our programs that for one reason or another are unable to avail themselves of state or federal unemployment benefits. And we also have a high number of folks we work with who really face chronic unemployment rather than situational unemployment. So there are neighborhoods in Birmingham where unemployment, particularly for Black Americans, particularly for Black men, has been at crisis level for decades. And then a few other things I will note particular to Alabama. One is that as a state, we have an expanded Medicaid. So by and large, the folks we serve do not have access to publicly supported health care. In terms of our own operations, we've been working towards the ability to provide a health stipend to workers, but we know that for many of them, access to health care is tenuous. And then I'll mention too that the municipal authority in Birmingham and in other cities in Alabama, as is true in a number of other states, is pretty tightly constrained by the state constitution. And there's a whole other conversation to be had there around the roots of that constitution and kind of the bureaucratic manifestation of racism in the powers that we see at the city level. But what it's meant for our operations is really that not only are we bound by the interpretation of CARES funding at the Treasury Department, which some people know there have been 34 different rule changes on the PPP program alone that have come out of Treasury, but also that we're bound by a particular set of interpretations happening at the state level. And in Alabama, we've learned recently that the state has about $1 billion of CARES funding yet to spend that has not been allocated. And again, we're approaching the end of the year when that money really will expire or potentially will roll back up into some state budget numbers. So what we've done at Birmingham Strong is do our best to target our resources in a way driven by commitments to racial equity, to ensure we pay a living wage, to ensure that our partnerships, when we're placing core members at an organization, prioritize minority serving and minority-led organizations. But I think these are real and persistent challenges, and the place where we're in geographically, and then also our scale, we're not in a position, I think, to be market shaping, which is what's so exciting about some of the programming that Derrick's talking about. And I'm curious around how the scale of Bruce's programming maybe starts to approach some of these questions. But we don't see ourselves having, at the scale we're at, that kind of market shaping impact, which is where it feels like we could start to see some bigger shifts.
Bruce, you're up.
I think you're on mute.
I'm the first to do it today. The California Conservation Corps is over 60% young adults of color. And so again, I talk about this on-the-job training, but that on-the-job training are working with sponsors, typically state or county or local. And those sponsors are city parks, county recreation parks, county public works, state parks, state Caltrans, transportation department, all kinds of different public entities where those young folks are getting hands-on experience working side by side on those projects sponsored by those public entities. And those public entities, those supervisors get to see those young folks work. And in addition, then those young folks find out about what it takes to do this kind of job, what does it take to get my qualifications up to that, or those experiences up to that entry-level position. And then we can, then on our side, we're working to provide that where we can, preferential hiring. If you log so many hours with the National Land Management Agency, or we work with our state to make those qualifications fit the entry-level positions that our young folks are interested in and working towards. And then we work closely with those young folks to make sure they have those not only job skills and experience, but they have some of those other skills, life skills that will make them more successful in obtaining these jobs. And all those things, I think, work towards a supportive government. In this case, not only our resources agency in California, but this Governor Newsom, has said he wants this to be a state, a California for all. And that means that agencies or organizations, departments like the CCC, we should reflect and look like California. And so when I say we're more than 60% young adults of color, those folks that are participating in the CCC then become, I believe, those future employees, they have those future careers with those state agencies and local agencies and organizations that typically have been challenged to look like California. And that comes in all phases of whether it be social services or, again, resource land management agencies. We feel we are on that track in creating those pathways to diversify and bring more opportunities for young folks that they so much deserve.
Thank you. Derrick.
Right, so labor market discrimination unjustly and immorally keeps a lot of people out of the labor market. A federal job guarantee would be a direct way to address that by literally guaranteeing employment for everyone. It would avoid some of the, the universal nature of it would avoid some of the stigmatizing impacts of government programs, by not targeting, but making it universal. Then it becomes a right. And we lose some of that stigmatizing effect that often goes into programs that are reserved for certain populations, I'd say. So that would be another useful benefit. And then I think we need to, I keep talking about economic rights, but even that is not enough. That we have to say anti-racist, anti-sexist economic rights, because we can look back to history from a lot of the New Deal policies and programs to realize that by design and implementation, they had racist elements. The Wagner Act, which is responsible, perhaps the greatest piece of legislation to offer bargaining power for workers in general, excluded domestic and agricultural workers even to today. And that is by design racist, especially in 1930s when over 90% of Black women were a domestic or agricultural worker when employed, and over half of Black men. So the concept of economic rights, in summary, literally provide everyone with a job that's good to combat labor market discrimination. And then two, reduces some of the stigmatizing effects because it's a guarantee and a right. And then finally, we should make sure we do it in an anti-racist way.
Thank you. I want to move on to some audience questions now. We have some really good ones. The first one I want to pose to the group is, well, I'm going to combine two of them. One question asks about the role of counties. What is the role of the local governments? How can they support this? And the second question is, how can these kinds of programs create a pathway for long-term employment? moving up to higher wages ideally? And should that be coupled with investments in related industries? So Suzanne, I'll start with you. Suzanne, I'll start with you first on the question about counties, and then you can chime in as well on the long-term employment.
Great. A few quick things that come to mind on the county question. You know, counties are such important and sizable human services providers, and also serve as a clearinghouse for a lot of the federal human services funding. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to think about investments in human services, not only as themselves investments in workforce development. One thing we haven't touched on, but that's so important, is wraparound funding, other kinds of services that help combat barriers to employment. But I think also, especially as we see ramping up, you know, contact tracing, for example, or other priorities that are rooted in the health authority that's often held at the county level, there's a real opportunity. Some places I know, Baltimore, Maryland, for example, is really using this as a dual approach to maximize workforce opportunity in addition to prioritizing a trained and sizable public health workforce on the contact tracing side. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in those provision of health services and in the approach of human services generally that's rooted in the county to think about doing that more with an eye towards workforce development. That's true also in community health work. We have some programs here where our core members have been aligned alongside existing community health work streams in the community. And you know, community health work is incredibly impactful in improving health outcomes, particularly in low-income communities and in communities of color. And I think one of the things we're seeing in the COVID crisis, as those communities are most hard hit, is the importance of investing in that kind of relational public health infrastructure to make us more resilient going forward. And just to briefly touch on the second part of the question before I make room for the other folks on the panel who will, I'm sure, have more brilliant things to say. We really are, in the first instance, a pandemic response organization. But as our work has taken root, and I think as it's become clear that this is going to be a longer and deeper crisis than any of us had necessarily originally thought, we're seeing the need to build long-term infrastructure. And for us, that looks like making a bit of a pivot from a focus on work relief to a focus on work opportunity, and thinking critically about our placements as opportunities for folks to build skills where that's appropriate. To be very candid, I think sometimes skill building gets a bit too much attention in the workforce development. And Martha, I think you and I have talked about this within workforce development. And there are times when labor market information and connection is maybe the more valuable portion, certainly, of what BHAM Strong provides. But I think as we look towards the future, we look towards opportunities for more sustainable funding streams, thinking about polling in WIOA. I think there is a real mandate here for us to focus on opportunities that are building skills in in-demand industries. And that's where, again, being rooted at the local level is so critical for us, that we can really pair, our work alongside where we perceive opportunity to be now and over the next several years.
Yeah, for me, Martha, it would be developing that, like I was talking just a few minutes ago, developing that kind of work ethic, I think, leads to those programs and career pathways. And it sounds so simple, but for us, for the CCC, I constantly remind myself that the things that I assume that young folks should know, I shouldn't assume those things. And that's so one of the great things that we do, it's so simple. It's just that basic work ethic. Show up to work on Monday, show up to work 40 hours a week, work well with others, follow directions, be able to take supervision and work with others, but from all different backgrounds and all different walks of life. And then I think, again, where we can strengthen those entry-level positions and make sure we're matching the things that our folks are learning or experiencing with those entry-level requirements or positions, where we can create incentives or priority hiring systems, and then also just continue to look at the whole person, not regardless of where they came from or where they started or how they were raised or brought up. we can't assume that everybody has the opportunities like I had as a young person, and so we have to constantly deal and address mental health first aid issues, constantly address substance abuse issues. We have to constantly address and look at, we know that we have young folks, 18-year-olds that are raising a child or more than a child, and that they're trying to make it on their own. It's still trying to get that career going. And so I think there are so many, to your first question, I think it also means leveraging and including and being a kind of as comprehensive of a kind of development plan that works with the county, that works with the city, that works with the state, that works with federal government to bring in all those different resources, leverage them to the best of our ability, that create those pathways that are not only genuine and real, but they're very doable.
Thank you. Derrick, I would like to, if I may, direct another question your way. This comes from Twitter. How would you respond to questions about how a federal job guarantee would affect public sector unions?
How would it affect public sector unions? Well, it could strengthen, well, it's aligned with the mission of unions, which is empowering workers. So it empowers workers whether they're employed or not. One could have provisions, and it relates to the last question also in terms of industrial policy. We could design jobs in areas by which we need greater work, and there isn't union professions that are protecting certain workers. There's nothing that precludes the program from even having being able to organize and be part of the public union. So a federal job guarantee worker should have the right to unionize and become part of the union. So I don't see it as necessarily competing with unions, but actually strengthening the missions that unions have.
Okay. So we now have about 3 minutes left. So I've saved the easiest question for last, which is, say that we did have a federal jobs guarantee. How would you think about implementing it in terms of perhaps starting with pilots at the state and local level, or a staggered start? We'll start with Derrick and then we'll move on.
I mean, you'd implement it over time. You'd have a lag. You would, one point about the previous questions, what can counties do? Well, counties don't have to wait on the federal government. The work of Susanna as well as Bruce are demonstrated that we don't have to wait. We could start. But with the implementation at the federal government level, you would plan it in a way that gives us enough time to get the full implementation. But I don't think we need demonstration. The greatest demonstration was the New Deal, the fact that we were able to come up with big public jobs, and we did it in a way that was comprehensive. We just didn't fulfill what FDR called for in 1944, was the full implementation of it. So I don't see that as a big counterpart. But I know I don't think I'm gonna get another chance. So I'm gonna say just a quick thing in that a couple of things related to the previous questions is that the program is aimed at not managing poverty, but promoting social mobility. That's a key point. It provides pathways. Right now, what do we do with poor people? We socially isolate them. We manage them. We manage their subsistence rather than trying to generate social mobility. The concept of benefit cliffs would not be relevant with a federal job guarantee as much, because we would begin at an adequate wage where the people wouldn't be in poverty to begin with. So, I think those things are important. In terms of industrial policy, because I think that's a critical question as well. So the industrial policy aspect of a federal job guarantee is currently we choose which industries the federal government invests in. There are concerns around automation that are plaguing our economy right now. The best defense against automation would literally be a federal job guarantee towards productive work. If we have an industrial policy aimed at putting workers first, not only would it be a direct source of stimulus that's more balanced than expecting a corporate dynastism to trickle down to all of us, with the risk that funding corporations to hire workers will only lead to substitution effects, it would also benefit corporations. If corporations didn't have to worry about a worker coming to work weary about childcare, elder care, or their health insurance, then that would be a benefit to them. And then, the last point is that job training is critical and is important. But what's cruel is job training without a job waiting for somebody. So I think we should commit to, if we're going to have public subsidy to job training, we should ensure that there's an actual job waiting for somebody who receives that job training.
Thank you. Well, I'm feeling a bit thwarted because I have a lot of other questions that I wanted to ask. We are at time, but I have been given permission by the almighty events manager to go a little bit over and to allow, thank you, Karen, to allow each of you to have a closing statement if you would like. And let me give you some parameters around that. For Susanna and Bruce, it would be, if you had a mandate to grow, how would you go about doing it so that you could grow responsibly? And then for Derrick, I will ask you about if you have any thoughts about how a federal jobs guarantee could include young adults, the so-called opportunity youth or disconnected youth. But Susanna, first, you. How would you grow?
So we, as I mentioned, we're really founded as a pandemic response organization, and I think the point that Derrick made in the final portion of his remarks just a minute ago is such a well taken one, and one that everyone who touches part of the workforce development ecosystem should really be thinking about, which is the connection between a training opportunity and jobs, and recognizing that. That a deficit-based approach thinking about skills gaps, while it can be a really important part of the literature and the practice, should not maybe be the dominant language that we use in thinking about how to drive talent and how to drive employment. So as we think about scaling here in Birmingham, a big portion of that conversation, frankly, is about funding sustainability. So moving beyond a reliance on the CARES Act, which has been our primary funding source, and thinking through opportunities to pull in either federal workforce funding or national service funding, and continue to kind of grow our track record here in a way that allows us to attract additional private philanthropic support, which has been a large part of supporting our work to date. And I think the other thing I'll mention, and maybe here I'm hopping back a bit to that implementation question, is recognizing that the answer to poverty is not exclusively jobs. And so having, I think some parameters around what jobs can and can't provide is really important. And an emphasis on those wraparound services, especially childcare, if we're thinking about this from a gender equity lens, is really critical. And in, I think the opportunity to build community across a service core. We've talked a lot about the economic impact of these programs, and certainly that's something that we see, and that's a way that we size the impact that we have here in Birmingham. But we also know that the folks working in our service core are people that have a heart to serve, and especially in a time of such isolation, it's been very meaningful for many of them in ways they've expressed to us, to have the opportunity to come alongside and be parts of kind of the solution for change in Birmingham, and certainly the solution to meet some immediate needs. So that's 3 or 4 different answers to 1 or 2 different questions, but just touching on everything else that's on my mind. And I do think that that final point that, the answer to poverty is not exclusively jobs is a really important one. And there's a lot that these programs can accomplish, and we're very proud of that. But keeping in mind that there is a really full and robust social services toolkit that can be integrated into some of this work, and that also needs to, stand separately and continue to be supported.
Thank you, Susanna. Bruce.
So this is something that I spend and my colleagues spend a lot of time thinking about and have been thinking about for many, many years. So I would say in some ways we're prepared, and we're prepared because the model, a positive working model already exists. Now it's a little bit different from core to core or from program to program, but I think it would be critical to again, take into account all those different resources at a federal, state, county, and local level. Make sure you leverage those resources. Look at new funding. It's not a coincidence that both Republicans and Democrats are touting a $1 trillion tree planting initiative. So you got to look at those kinds of programs. It's encouraging that this legislator and this president passed the Great American Outdoors Act. So look at funding like that. Look at how you can expand on funding like that. We already know where those underserved, underrepresented communities are. So we need to really hone in and focus on those so that we're addressing the needs in communities, not just urban communities, but rural communities as well. And then again, include not just public input, but also philanthropic, corporate, and everybody else that stands to gain from young folks, in my case, young folks, some, again, from the most underserved and underrepresented communities, going to work, being productive family members, giving to their communities, and doing something good for this country.
Thank you. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and add my own 2 cents to that question and of how to grow responsibly. And one thing I would worry about is the temptation to, in order to save money, to go cheap on the staffing and administration so that you can direct. Most of the money is going to go to wages in any case. But if you try to put the administration of a program like this on a starvation diet, you're going to have a lower quality program because you need the staff people who can set up the program, match the people to the jobs, prepare them, work with state and local government, nonprofits, etc. So now, Derrick, the question that I just gave you out of the blue, I'm not sure if it's something that you've thought about much, but there has been a great deal of public attention of late about young people, generally, roughly aged 18 to 24-ish, and especially those who aren't on track for a college degree, and then just a smooth transition into a career. So how could a federal jobs guarantee work for them?
I want to begin in the tradition of Al Gore with an inconvenient truth, and that is the private sector is inadequate in its ability to supply enough quality jobs to all workers or to fulfill our public infrastructure needs. That's a reality. And that said, over the recent course of a great recession and a pandemic right now, the economic scarring that particularly impacts young people, we need to acknowledge that. In the last great recession, we told them, wait out this recession, go to school, better yourself, get some skills. They acquired record levels of debt that is untenable. So we saddled them with that, and then now that generation is faced with a double whammy as a result of this pandemic. No fault of their own. As Susanna described, there is no silver bullet policy to address all of our concerns and economic needs. In fact, I would desire that young people have a pathway towards a debt-free public education, not only through grade school, but all the way through college in the 21st century. Not doing that, in my mind, is the government not fulfilling its fiduciary responsibility. So that's all true. But that said, so not only with the privilege of going to school, authentic agency requires that we facilitate people to really fulfill their choice and engage in their work. And this is why a federal job guarantee becomes useful. It becomes useful, and not only in a targeted way. Targeted programs can be good, but in a destigmatizing way that offers young people a pathway towards a great education, but then also a pathway towards work and a productive job with decent wages.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a great note to end on. Let me thank again all our panelists, Susanna, Bruce, and Derrick, and to the Senator Klobuchar for taking time to give us some remarks, and thank all of you for joining us. And have a good rest of your day.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.